For as much as I talk about cycling and the importance of being able to travel without the use of a car, I'm actually a car enthusiast, believe it or not. A lot of people don't know this, but I am very into cars. I've always been into cars ever since I was a little boy. And now at the age of 25, I'm still enthusiastic about cars. Rest assured that anytime I have a vision board, there is a car on that vision board. That said, being here in the Netherlands has shown me that not everyone is a car enthusiast. And of course, not everyone in the US is a car enthusiast either. But what I've noticed here in the Netherlands, above all else, is that cars serve a different purpose than they do back home. In the Netherlands, a car is a form of transportation that takes you from where you are to where you want to go and back, ideally. In the US, cars are status symbols. They are ways in which we convey our significance to other people. Now, again, I am making sweeping generalizations here. So there are obviously going to be exceptions to this rule on either side of the fence. However, by and large, this one difference in the general function, the perceived function of vehicles, is what underpins every other difference that I'm going to divulge throughout this video. That said, the first difference between Dutch cars and American cars is that Dutch cars tend to be much smaller. Dutch cars tend to be a lot smaller. So to put this into perspective, back home, if you go to Hertz or Budget Car Rental or Avis or any of these car rental companies and you rent out a small car, you pick a small car, you are going to be given a Toyota Corolla or a Honda Civic, something along those lines. So a compact sedan, that is a small car back home. If you request a mid-sized car, you're going to receive a Honda Accord, Toyota Camry, or something along those lines. Here in the Netherlands, that Toyota Corolla or that Honda Civic, those are mid-sized sedans. Here, they have a whole other category of cars that we don't really have back home, which I believe are known as subcompact cars. So this would be your Honda Fit, your Toyota Yaris, your Toyota Aygo, or cars along those lines, these very small hatchback cars. And honestly, here in the Netherlands, I've seen cars that literally don't even look like they belong on the road. And if you have one of those cars, I'm not trying to insult you or your car, shout out to you, but I've seen cars here that I don't think you could legally drive on the street back home. Okay, cars like this right here. If you're Dutch and you have one of these or you've driven one of these, please explain to me what this car is all about, because I'd love to know more about it. But I'm saying this to say that the cars here, the overall reference point of size of a car is much different than back home. Back home, I believe the best-selling car in the US for the past few years has been the Ford F-150. That is the best-selling car in the US, and it's very apparent when you drive down American streets, especially in a state like Texas, where I come from. In Texas, a lot of people drive trucks and SUVs. These are cars that are not only very large by Dutch standards, but are actually impractical by Dutch standards. Because ultimately here in the Netherlands, because the roads and all of the infrastructure are so much smaller compared to back home in the US, it's not really viable to use a very large car as your daily driver. It's possible, yes, I have seen some people doing it. I've seen some people out here maybe driving pickup trucks or the occasional SUV, full-sized SUV that is, but they are the exception, not the rule, and they always stand out, and it always seems like, at least from the outside looking in, a very big inconvenience on their part to have to parallel park that Dodge Ram in that little parking space. So there's a general incompatibility here when it comes to the size of cars, or at least the size of those larger cars, the trucks and SUVs, with the infrastructure. But on top of that, I think a big part of the reason why Dutch people tend to favor smaller cars is because they are incentivized to get smaller cars because of the road tax. What is road tax? So if you're an American like me, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you're Dutch, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, road tax is the tax that you pay for owning your car, and you pay the tax according to the weight of your car. So in other words, if you have a Ford F-150 or similar, if you just have a large, heavy car in general, you are basically going to have to pay extra because you have that large car. And it makes sense because if you have a larger, heavier car, then you are creating a disproportionate amount of wear and tear on the roads. Therefore, you should have to pay more. And I think this is fair. This is fair. Some people think that people shouldn't be allowed to have these big cars altogether. I disagree. I think people should be able to have whatever kind of car they want, but they should have to pay the price for it, literally and figuratively. And here in the Netherlands, if you want to have a big car like that, you are going to pay the price for it. Plain and simple. So you can imagine most Dutch people who are not only known to be very pragmatic people, but also tend to be very frugal and financially conscious people, they're not trying to pay that extra road tax. Now, the next difference that I've observed between Dutch cars and American cars is Dutch cars, by and large, tend to be manual. They tend to have a manual transmission, whereas back home in the US, we tend to drive automatic cars. Now, if you're Dutch and you drive a manual car, I would actually love to know why most people here favor manual cars. It could just be a matter of the dealers supplying more of these cars than automatics. But at the same time, if there wasn't a demand for it, the dealers wouldn't be supplying it. So back home, nobody that I know drives a manual car unless they are a car enthusiast and have a performance car. So I know people who drive, let's say for example, Corvettes or BMW M3s, cars like that, which I will say as a car enthusiast, although I don't know how to drive a manual car, that would, I'd imagine, enhance the driving experience of a performance car. But for a Honda Fit, I don't imagine that that would create much of a performance difference. But again, Dutch people aren't necessarily concerned about performance in that regard. They're more concerned about performance in terms of getting you from point A to point B in the most efficient and effective way. So bearing that in mind, I'm sure that there is some kind of practical benefit, just knowing Dutch people and how their minds operate, there is some kind of practical benefit to driving a manual car. It could just be a matter of price. Even if it's just a matter of price, that alone would be a benefit of having a manual car, because I'm pretty sure manual cars tend to be a lot less expensive than their automatic counterparts. But I would imagine that there's probably some other hidden benefit that I'm just not aware of at this point in time. And personally, again, I've never driven a manual, but from the outside looking in, it seems a lot more mentally strenuous, psychologically taxing to drive a car that requires you to put in that much extra effort. Because I'm the kind of person, I like to eat when I drive and stuff like that. You probably shouldn't do that. I probably shouldn't do that either. But that's just how I get down. And I would imagine it'd be really inconvenient to try to shift gears while eating at the same time. But I digress. Again, you shouldn't be doing that. But the next difference between American cars and Dutch cars is Dutch cars tend to get better fuel efficiency. Now, I don't have any statistic to back this up, but this is more of a common sense observation. And now that I think about it, this right here might be the reason why Dutch people favor manual cars. Because to my knowledge, manual transmissions tend to be more fuel efficient than automatic transmissions. Because when you cruise in the highest gear, your car gets much better fuel efficiency. I could be wrong about that, but to my knowledge, that is the case. And aside from cars being manual transmission, again, they're smaller. So them being smaller in and of itself means that they're going to be more fuel efficient because it takes less power to move them. So cars here tend to be much better on gas, which obviously is not just better for Dutch people's pockets, especially because gas prices here are much higher than they are back home in the US, even in places like California, for example, but also it's better for the environment. It's much better for the environment. And again, I am a car enthusiast, but I would almost call myself an environmentalist as well. I do care about the environment. I do care about negating, or at the very least slowing down, climate change. But that's a whole different topic for a whole different day. Dutch cars tend to be much more fuel efficient, and not only that, but a lot of cars here tend to utilize alternative sources of fuel, and in particular, electric fuel. A lot of cars here run on electricity. I've seen many more electric cars, not just in terms of the absolute number of them or the relative number of them, but the variety of them. I've seen a much larger variety of electric vehicles here than I ever saw back home. I've seen brands that, again, I've literally never heard of before. Now, I do see my fair share of Teslas, which, fun fact, that is my dream car. Anyways, I've seen people driving Teslas, but I've also seen people driving these obscure brands that still look very nice and modern. And sometimes even when I look inside of the cars, the interior looks very nice, but I've literally just never heard of the brands before. And for me personally, at least back home in the US, I don't know if this is the case here as well, but that would seem like a logistical nightmare because I always got my car serviced at the dealer. And if I can't find a dealer that sells that specific car or that specific brand of car, then I basically have to rely on the local mechanic who may not know how to work on that specific car. So I don't know if there are just a wider variety of dealers here than there are back home, or how Dutch people kind of navigate the logistics of that. But I will say that the electric cars that I've seen out here tend to be really nice, just clean, modern, and very functional as well.